My parents tried to bribe the guy to break up with me. He said no. So we ran away together. All right, here's what happened to me. It all started with a thunderstorm. Not just any storm either. One of those Midwestern spring squalls that seem to fall out of the sky like punishment. The kind that turns day into night, sends trash cans tumbling down the street, and makes even the pigeons take cover. I was standing in the middle of downtown Minneapolis, soaked to the bone, hugging my portfolio case like it could protect me from the lightning that flashed so close it lit up my skin. I had just finished a late afternoon critique session at the design school and was heading home, but of course, Uber had other plans. My ride got canceled last minute due to weather conditions, and suddenly I was stranded. I ducked into the first place I saw, a tiny corner coffee shop I'd walked past 100 times but never entered. It looked like it had been teleported straight out of 1997. Dim lighting, shelves stacked high with used books, mismatched chairs, and the sharp scent of espresso mingling with the faint must of old paper. I shook off the rain and stepped inside, trying not to drip all over everything. That's when I saw him. He was behind the counter, wiping down mugs like he actually cared how shiny they were. Wavy dark hair, tall, maybe a year or two older than me, sleeves rolled up, tattoo on his forearm peeking out just enough to catch my eye. He looked up and smiled, and it wasn't that forced customer service smile. It was the kind that felt like it was just for me. "You look like you fought the storm and lost," he said, still drying mugs. I laughed and brushed wet hair off my forehead. I definitely did. My Uber bailed on me. Yeah, they've been canceling left and right. You're not the only one marooned here. I ordered a chai latte, mostly because I was too cold to think straight. He handed it to me with a smirk and said, "Housemaid. If it sucks, you can sue me." The way he said it made me laugh. I took a seat near the back, next to a space heater that looked older than I was. The place was half empty, which made sense. No one sane was out in this weather. Except me, apparently. And him. After about 15 minutes of me pretending to read a tattered graphic novel I'd pulled off the shelf, he came around the counter and started reshelving books near where I was sitting. I looked up and, without thinking, said, "Is it weird that this place smells exactly like my childhood library?" He grinned and crouched down to slot in a thick hardcover. Not weird at all. Smells half the charm. It's the one thing we refuse to modernize. And that was it. That was the spark. We started talking. About comics at first. How both of us grew up obsessed with X-Men and Teen Titans. How we both thought the 90s animation era was peak childhood. At one point, I made a joke about being one of those weird kids who liked the Batman Beyond series more than the original. His eyes lit up, and he launched into a full 5-minute rant on why Terry McGinnis deserved more respect. We were two strangers in a bookstore, taking shelter from a storm, talking like we'd done this 100 times. His name was Jacob, or Jake, as he introduced himself once we were well into our mutual obsession with Gotham lore. He was 26, worked part-time as a barista, part-time helping the store owner with managing book orders, and spent the rest of his hours illustrating a webcomic I'd actually heard of. I nearly choked on my drink when I realized that Sketch J was him. I'd been following his stuff on Tumblr since college. "I feel like I just met a celebrity," I said, holding out my phone to show him I was following him already. He blushed. Actually blushed. God, please don't go back to the archive. The early stuff is painful. I stayed longer than I meant to. The storm didn't stop, but I stopped noticing. By the time the shop owner locked the front door and flipped the closed sign, we were still sitting there, now at the bar, sipping lukewarm coffee and trying to remember all the lyrics to the Animaniacs theme song. When I finally stood up to leave, reluctantly, Jake walked me to the door. The rain had let up just slightly, still drizzling, but not apocalyptic. I pulled my hoodie over my head and turned to say goodbye when he reached behind the counter and handed me a bright red umbrella. "You'll need this," he said, pressing it into my hands. "But only if you promise to return it." I raised an eyebrow. "Oh, you want it back?" He smiled, a little crooked this time. "Only if you're in the mood to see me again." That was the moment. Not a grand gesture, not a big declaration. Just an umbrella, a smile, and a silent understanding that this wasn't the last time we were going to talk. I took the umbrella. I walked out into the rain, feeling warmer than I had all day. We started seeing each other not long after that stormy night. I returned the umbrella a week later, though to be honest, it didn't even rain that day. I just wanted to see him again. He smiled the second I walked in, like he'd been waiting, and from that moment on, it was like something quietly clicked into place between us. No fanfare, no dramatic confessions, just this slow, steady unfolding of something real. The first few months were the kind of soft, gentle perfect I hadn't really believed in before. I'd been in a couple relationships before, but they always felt like work. Like I was trying to keep up with someone else's expectations, constantly worried about saying too much or not enough. But with Jacob, it was easy. Effortless in the way that only happens when two people actually listen to each other. He was unlike anyone I'd ever dated. He didn't come from money, not even close. He lived in a small 2-bedroom apartment with his mom, who worked as an elementary school teacher in a public district outside the city. She was kind, sharp in that no-nonsense Midwestern way, and clearly adored him. Their place wasn't fancy, second-hand furniture, old hardwood floors that creaked, but it was filled with books, warm light, and this quiet sense of love that I wasn't used to seeing between adults. Jacob had gotten himself into a state college completely on his own, studying literature with a focus on early American fiction. He used to joke that he was the only guy in a sea of people trying to become sports analysts or engineers who spent his nights buried in Hawthorne and Dickinson. He was working 2 jobs while juggling full-time classes, one at the bookstore cafe where we met and another at a used clothing store that smelled permanently of lavender and dryer sheets. On top of that, he picked up freelance editing gigs through some site I'd never heard of. Manuscripts, blog posts, marketing copy. You name it, he cleaned it up, polished it, made it sound better. That's how he paid the bills. I remember being floored the first time I stayed up with him while he worked. We were sitting side by side on his couch, my laptop on my knees, his cracked old MacBook balanced on a tray. It was after midnight, and I had a project due, but I couldn't focus. I kept watching him tap away, eyes flicking back and forth between paragraphs, deleting a word here, rephrasing a sentence there. He wasn't just going through the motions, he actually cared. Cared about the quality, about doing it right, even if it was just some corporate newsletter no one would ever read. I asked him once why he tried so hard, and he just shrugged and said, "If someone's trusting me with their words, I owe it to them to make them better." That hit me harder than I let on. He asked about my work, too, not just in the polite, distracted way people do when they want to seem interested, but with actual curiosity. I showed him my design portfolio one night, expecting him to smile and nod through it, but he sat beside me on the floor, barefoot and cross-legged, asking real questions. Like why I'd chosen that particular color palette for my book cover mock-up, or what the original sketch looked like before I digitized it. No one had ever really looked at my work like that before, not even my professors. One night, he came to one of our student gallery shows, completely exhausted from a double shift, and still walked around the whole room just to stand in front of my piece for a few extra minutes. I didn't say anything, but when I looked at him from across the room and saw him smiling at my poster design like it was a real thing, like it deserved to be there, I felt something I hadn't let myself feel in years. Seen. Not just liked. Not just approved of. But actually seen. He was good to me. Kind in ways that weren't loud or dramatic. He'd bring me little things. Cold brew from the place he liked near the river, a dog-eared poetry book he found in the shop's donation bin, a mechanical pencil, because I once said mine always broke halfway through sketching. He remembered things. He asked about things. He stayed when I was moody or quiet or stuck in my head, never demanding I snap out of it or explain myself. We didn't go out much. We couldn't really afford to, but it never mattered. Some nights we just walked along the Mississippi, not even saying anything, just holding hands and listening to the rush of the water and the sound of our footsteps on the wet sidewalk. Other times we'd crash at his place, cook whatever we could find in his pantry, usually pasta or rice with some combination of canned vegetables, and watch bootleg Studio Ghibli movies on his ancient laptop. I never once felt like I had to earn his love. I didn't have to impress him. I didn't have to shrink myself to fit into the version of me someone else wanted. He made space for me, the whole of me, and I was starting to believe I could do the same for him. It scared me a little, how quickly I trusted him. But I did. And for the first time in my life, I felt like that trust wasn't misplaced. The first time I told my parents about Jacob, I knew exactly how it was going to go, and yet somehow it still managed to sting more than I expected. We were sitting in the sunroom at our house in Edina, everything just a little too white, a little too perfect, like a magazine spread pretending to be a family home. My mom, Rachel, was perched on the edge of the love seat like she always was, back straight, heels still on even though we were indoors. My dad, Donald, had a glass of scotch in his hand even though it was barely past lunch. Classic Saturday. I hadn't planned to bring him up that day. We'd just gotten back from visiting campus, and I was already bracing for one of my dad's usual monologues about networking opportunities and career pathways. But then my mom asked me, almost casually, "Are you seeing anyone right now?" And my mouth moved before I had the chance to think twice. "Yeah, actually. His name's Jacob. We've been seeing each other for a few months." There was a pause, like they were both waiting for me to realize I'd made a mistake and walk it back. My dad raised an eyebrow, swirling his drink. "Jacob, what does he do?" "He works part-time at a bookstore cafe, and he's a freelance editor," I said, trying to sound neutral. "He's also studying literature. At State." The silence that followed felt heavier than it should have. My mom was the first to break it. State, as in the public one? I nodded. Yeah. She gave a tight little smile and looked down at her perfectly manicured hands. How interesting. My dad didn't even try to hide his skepticism. And what does his family do? He lives with his mom. She's a teacher. Another pause. He took a sip of scotch, then gave me that look he always did when I said something he considered beneath my potential. So no father in the picture? I don't think so, I said, starting to feel that familiar tension build in my jaw. It's just him and his mom. She's great, by the way. Rachel cleared her throat lightly and looked at me like she was choosing her words carefully, which usually meant she wasn't going to be honest, just polite in that way that slices you open without ever raising her voice. Sweetheart, we're not judging. We just want to understand who this person is. You know how important it is to surround yourself with people who share your values and your ambitions. Donald leaned forward slightly. It's not about where he comes from. It's about what that background says about where he's going. You're at one of the most competitive design programs in the country, Samantha. That's not something we pay for lightly. We expect you to make choices that reflect that investment. I could feel the heat rise in my face. So because he didn't go to a private school or come from money, that makes him, what? Less valuable. He didn't even flinch. It makes things complicated. Relationships are hard enough without adding in vastly different expectations. My mom reached over and put her hand on mine, soft and cold. We're just saying, don't get too serious too fast. You've always had a habit of seeing the best in people, which is lovely, but it can also be naive. It took everything in me not to pull my hand away. I knew this was coming. My parents were old school in a way that bordered on theatrical. My dad still called waiters son and thought social media was ruining the country. My mom had been on the cover of Vogue once in the late 80s and never let anyone forget it. Now she ran a charity that threw luncheons and raised money for things that looked good in press releases. They believed in pedigree. They believed in class, and not the kind you took at school. And more than anything, they believed that their financial support gave them a right to audit every part of my life like I was some investment portfolio they were tracking. They didn't come right out and say he's not good enough for you. But they didn't have to. The message was loud and clear. I left that day feeling like I'd been squeezed into a version of myself that didn't fit anymore. Like I'd worn a dress that looked great on a hanger but twisted and pinched in all the wrong places when I actually put it on. When I told Jacob about the conversation later, he didn't get angry. He didn't even seem surprised. He just nodded slowly and said, I figured they wouldn't love the idea. It made me sad, how quickly he accepted that, how used he was to being written off. But more than that, it made me want to fight for him. Because he wasn't some passing phase. He wasn't a rebellious choice. He was the first person in a long time who made me feel like I could breathe without being edited. And that was something I wasn't willing to give up, not for anyone. The first time I brought Jacob to dinner at my parents' house, I knew it was going to be awkward, but I didn't expect it to feel like walking him into an ambush. He wore a pale blue button-down shirt. Nothing fancy, just clean, neat, and ironed with the kind of quiet care that spoke volumes about how much he wanted to make a good impression. I could tell he was nervous the second we pulled into the driveway, the way he ran his hand through his hair twice before stepping out of the car. Inside, everything was as staged as ever. The dining room table was set with the kind of precision that only happens when you have staff doing it or your mom's been practicing for the cover of Architectural Digest her whole life. Candlelight, soft jazz in the background, heavy linen napkins folded into shapes no one asked for. My mom greeted us with a smile that never touched her eyes. Jacob, right? She said, offering her hand with all the warmth of a winter windshield. Yes, ma'am. Thank you for having me, he said, calm, polite, the way he always was. It lasted exactly 9 minutes. We had barely sat down, not even through the salad course, when my mom reached across the table to top off my dad's wine glass. Her hand slipped, and half the glass of deep red Merlot landed directly on Jacob's chest. The splash was sudden, loud, and awful. Jacob jolted back in his chair, instinctively trying to dab at it with his napkin, but the stain was already spreading like blood. Oh dear, my mother said, her voice dry as dust. That shirt might be ruined. She didn't say sorry. Not really. She just stared at the growing blotch and added, some stains never really come out, no matter how hard you try. Then she took another sip of wine, like nothing had happened. I froze. I didn't know whether to grab a towel, shout, or just walk out. Jacob gave this little half-smile, trying to downplay it, and said something like, it's okay. No harm done. Even though it clearly wasn't okay. My dad didn't even look up from his plate. The rest of the meal limped along in silence, awkward and tight, like we were all holding our breath for something else to go wrong. I thought that would be the worst of it. I thought maybe it had actually been a mistake, that maybe she'd just been careless or drunk. But then it happened again. The next dinner, a few weeks later, Jacob showed up wearing a darker shirt. He didn't say anything, but I knew why he'd chosen it. He was trying to be smart. Safe. My mom had asked me to bring him again, which I now realize should have been the first red flag. We made it through appetizers and were halfway through the main course when she leaned forward to pour more wine. This time, accidentally, knocking over the bottle itself, not just a glass. The bottle tilted, and the wine sloshed straight across the table, arcing toward Jacob like it had been aimed. It hit the edge of his plate, splashed up, and soaked the sleeve and lap of his shirt. A few drops hit the tablecloth, but most of it landed on him. She gasped a single sharp inhale, and then said, "Oh no, again? I really must be more careful." There was a long pause. Jacob stared down at his shirt, jaw clenched so tight I thought he might crack a molar. He didn't look at her, didn't look at me. He just slowly reached for the napkin, dabbed at his arm, and said, "It's fine. I'll take care of it." My dad was suddenly very interested in his wine glass. My mom tilted her head slightly and added, "Next time, you might want to avoid lighter fabrics. Red wine is unforgiving." That was when it clicked. It wasn't an accident. It had never been an accident. The room felt like it was closing in on me. I wanted to scream. I wanted to take the bottle and dump it over her own pristine beige sweater. But instead, I just sat there, stunned, watching Jacob sit through the rest of the dinner like it didn't matter, like he hadn't just been humiliated twice in the same house by the same woman. He never complained, never said a word about it afterward. But I saw the way he balled his shirt up when we got back to my apartment. I saw the look in his eyes when he dropped it into the sink and watched the wine swirl down the drain. And I felt this sharp, ugly shame coil in my stomach because I had brought him there. Because I hadn't stopped it. Because I had let them treat him like a stain they could wash away. I wasn't even looking for anything. That's what still gets me. I wasn't snooping. I wasn't suspicious. I was just trying to pull up a recipe. My mom had made some lemon thyme chicken the week before, and, against all odds, I actually liked it. She'd mentioned she saved it on her tablet, so while she was upstairs on a call, I grabbed it from the kitchen counter and started scrolling through her browser tabs. That's when I saw it. Not the recipe, not Pinterest, not even her usual sea of charity auction spreadsheets. No, what caught my eye was a photo. My photo. It was one of the pictures Jacob had taken of me a couple months earlier. We'd gone to that rooftop art market, the one where the light hit just right around sunset. I'd worn that deep green dress I only bring out on days I feel like someone worth noticing. He'd caught me laughing, holding a plastic cup of rose, wind pulling my hair just enough to make it look candid. It was one of my favorite pictures of myself. I had no idea it was on my mother's tablet. I clicked it. It opened up to a profile page. Her name, well, not her actual name, but close enough to be familiar, was listed on some elite matchmaking site I'd never heard of, the kind that probably charges a background check fee just to see someone's first name. Under the picture, the caption read, "Looking for a man with drive, influence, and class. Ambition isn't optional." There were more. Another photo of me in the sculpture garden. One from a wedding I went to last fall. And then one of me at graduation, posed with my diploma, the school logo blurred out like she thought that would keep it anonymous. I felt something crack inside me. My stomach dropped, and my hands started shaking before my mind had fully caught up. She came downstairs a few minutes later, still holding her phone, laughing softly at whatever call she'd just ended. I was standing there in the kitchen, her tablet in my hands, face pale, barely able to form words. "What is this?" I asked, not bothering to keep my voice even. She paused mid-step, took one look at the screen, and didn't even flinch. Didn't rush to explain. Didn't act caught. "Oh," she said, setting her phone down. "That. I was just testing the market." I stared at her, stunned. Testing the market? She walked past me like I was being ridiculous, poured herself a glass of cucumber water, and leaned against the island like we were about to have a casual chat about holiday plans. "It's just an exercise, Samantha," she said lightly. "Nothing serious. I was curious what kind of men were out there. What kinds of profiles they responded to. That sort of thing." I could barely breathe. "You uploaded pictures of me. You pretended to be me. You wrote things I would never say. Do you have any idea how invasive that is?" She rolled her eyes, like I was being dramatic. "It's not like I was catfishing people. I didn't message anyone. I didn't even activate the premium membership. You're overreacting. You used my graduation photo." I snapped louder now. "You put my face on a site looking for some rich stranger to sweep me off my feet. What the hell were you thinking?" "I was thinking," she said, setting down her glass, "that maybe if you weren't so caught up with that boy and his secondhand books, you'd see the opportunities you're wasting." There it was. All the wine stains and passive-aggressive jabs suddenly made sense. This wasn't about Jacob. This wasn't even about me, not really. It was about the image she wanted to project, the kind of daughter she thought she should have. One who dated hedge fund heirs and wore pearls to brunch. One who didn't fall for bookstore boys who worked 2 jobs and still made time to ask about her dreams. I don't need you managing my life like it's one of your charity auctions, I said quietly. And I don't need your approval to know when something feels real. Her face tightened. You're too young to know what's real. Love doesn't pay for private universities or get your foot in the door at creative firms. The world doesn't work on sentiment, Samantha. It works on alliances. Then maybe I don't want your world. She didn't answer, just walked away, cool as ever, and left me standing there in her polished kitchen with that ugly realization pressing into my chest, that she didn't see me as a person with a future of my own, just a piece to be moved, positioned, arranged. She never apologized, not even when I confronted her again the next day. She just kept insisting it was harmless. Just a few pictures, just a little curiosity. Like putting my face and name into the hands of strangers was no big deal. But for me, it was the line. And she crossed it without even blinking. It was one of those forced Sunday dinners my parents insisted on hosting once a month, the kind where everything looks perfect on the surface, but you can feel the tension humming beneath the tablecloth. Jacob had come because I asked him to, and because, despite everything, he still wanted to believe they could warm up to him. He sat quietly beside me at the long dining table, folded linen napkin on his lap, back straight, answering questions politely and with that steady calm that I loved so much. But I could see the way his jaw tightened every time my father spoke. It started small, as always. My dad asked Jacob how things were going at the bookstore, and Jacob answered honestly, telling him about a recent reordering system he'd helped implement and the bump in foot traffic after a new local author started doing readings there. He even mentioned a new freelance project he'd picked up, editing a novel for a small publisher. My dad listened, nodding slowly, and then, in that measured tone he always used when he was about to insult someone under the guise of conversation, said, interesting. Though I have to wonder how much longevity a business like that really has. Independent bookstores are charming, sure, but in the real world, those places don't last. Jacob didn't flinch, but he didn't respond either. He just looked down at his plate and picked at a piece of asparagus like the comment hadn't landed square in his chest. I opened my mouth, but before I could say anything, my mother jumped in, like she'd been waiting for the moment. Did I tell you about Laura Kensington's daughter? She asked, her voice unnaturally light. She's seeing a dentist from Boston. Just opened his second practice. Only 31. Isn't that lovely? She was smiling directly at me when she said it. Not even subtle. He's already talking about buying property in the Berkshires, she added, as if that was the measure of a man's worth. Laura says he's very driven. And such clean shoes. Jacob shifted slightly in his seat. I could feel the heat rising in my face. Mom, I said, my voice sharp enough to make the cutlery clink. What does that have to do with anything? She blinked innocently. I'm just saying, it's good to think about the future. You've worked so hard, sweetheart. You deserve someone who can keep up with you. She doesn't need someone to keep up, I snapped. She needs someone who supports her, who listens to her, who treats her like an equal. That's Jacob. My dad raised an eyebrow, unimpressed. Support is nice, but it doesn't pay the bills. Life has a way of getting complicated, Samantha. You'll learn that eventually. Jacob works 2 jobs, I said, my voice rising before I could stop it. And he freelances on top of that. He doesn't come from money, and he doesn't expect handouts. Everything he has, he's earned. My mom gave a tight smile. I'm sure he's very hardworking. But let's be honest, some people start behind, and they never really catch up. That's just reality. Jacob stayed silent. Not because he didn't have anything to say, but because I think he knew that nothing he said would change their minds. He'd already been judged before he walked through the door. I didn't ask you to evaluate him, I said, trying to keep my voice from shaking. This isn't a performance review. My dad leaned back in his chair and crossed his arms. We're just trying to make sure you're not wasting your potential. It's not personal. Of course it's personal, I shot back. You're sitting there picking apart someone you barely know because he doesn't fit into your checklist of what a successful man looks like. The room went quiet. My mom's smile faltered. My dad took a long sip of wine, as if he was done with the conversation and I was the one being unreasonable. I looked at Jacob, who hadn't said a word through all of it. He just reached under the table and gently touched my hand, a small, grounding gesture that made me want to cry. He shouldn't have to defend himself to people who only saw what he lacked on paper. And I was done pretending this was normal. I was done letting them take polite jabs at him like he couldn't feel every word. Because I knew who he was. I saw everything they refused to see. And I wasn't going to stay silent while they tried to erase it. I was in the study, crouched next to the desk, trying to help my dad transfer some files from his old laptop to the new one he'd been putting off setting up for weeks. He was in the adjacent sitting room with my mom, and I hadn't thought much of it when they stepped out of view. I figured they were just waiting for me to finish syncing his email or checking on some paperwork. The door was slightly ajar, and their voices carried just enough that I caught a few words without meaning to. At first, I wasn't even paying attention, just background noise while I typed in passwords and adjusted settings. But then I heard my dad's voice, low and deliberate. "He's just using her," he said. I froze. My fingers hovered over the keyboard. "It's clear as day," he continued. "She pays for the dinners, she drives him around. She props him up while he pretends that bookstore job means anything." My mouth went dry. I didn't even breathe. Then my mom spoke, quieter but with that same clipped sharpness she always used when she thought she was being strategic. "We have to act. Before it gets worse. Before she makes it permanent." My fingers went numb. I felt this rush of heat rise up my neck. The kind of heat that doesn't come from anger right away, but from something closer to humiliation. They weren't just criticizing Jacob. They were building a case. Planning something. Against us. I didn't even realize I was holding a glass of water until it slipped out of my hand and hit the hardwood with a dull, heavy crack. It didn't shatter, but the sound was enough. The room went quiet. A moment later, I saw them both standing in the doorway. My mother's eyes flicked to the floor, then back to my face. My dad didn't say anything at first. Neither of them looked ashamed. They didn't even look surprised. "How long were you standing there?" my dad asked, his voice stiff. "I wasn't standing," I said quietly. "I was doing the laptop like you asked." My mom folded her arms, her expression unreadable. "Well, if you're going to eavesdrop on private conversations, you should be prepared to hear things you don't like." "You weren't whispering," I said. "You were in the next room." "That doesn't mean it was meant for you," she snapped. "Honestly, Samantha, this is exactly what we're talking about. This dramatization, this constant need to make everything about you." "About me?" I repeated, stunned. "You were talking about Jacob like he's some con artist, and I'm too stupid to see it." "We were having a conversation," my dad said flatly. "As adults. Because we're concerned." "No," I said. "You were being cruel." My mom let out a sigh like I was exhausting her. "Sweetheart, it's not cruelty to worry about your future. You're throwing away everything we've worked so hard to give you." "No," I said again, louder this time. "You're just angry that I'm not following your script. That I picked someone who isn't part of your little country club fantasy." My dad stepped forward. "Watch your tone." "Or what?" I asked, my voice shaking now. "You'll call me ungrateful again? You'll tell me he's a leech? That I'm being manipulated because he doesn't own a condo and a pressed blazer?" "We just want better for you," my mother said, like it was the most obvious thing in the world. "Better," I echoed, practically laughing. "You mean richer, whiter, sharper-jawed with a six-figure trust fund and a golf membership. That's what you want." They didn't deny it. I stood there in that immaculate room with the glass rolling slowly across the floor, with the perfectly staged furniture and the cold, sterile air, and for the first time, I didn't feel like their daughter. I felt like an object. Something fragile they were trying to polish, control, display. And I realized that the second I stepped out of the mold they'd shaped for me, they didn't know what to do with me anymore. No apologies came. No regret. Just silence and that same exhausted look they always gave me when I dared to live my life outside their expectations. And in that silence, something finally shifted. It was 3 days after that awful moment in the study. I hadn't spoken to my parents since. I hadn't even responded to my mom's short, performative text about understanding that emotions were high. I thought that was the worst of it, that hearing them talk about Jacob like a parasite behind closed doors was the low point. But then Jacob asked to come over after his shift, and the look on his face told me something had happened. Something bad. He sat down on the edge of my bed and didn't say anything right away. Just rubbed his hands together, eyes fixed on the floor like he was rehearsing the words before he said them. "I wasn't going to tell you," he finally said. "I didn't want to make things harder. But after the other night, I think you should know." That was when he told me. A couple of days earlier, my dad had come into the coffee shop, alone. Jacob was behind the counter, making someone's core to do, when he looked up and saw him standing there like it was the most casual thing in the world. No greeting. No small talk. Just a clipped, "Can we talk privately?" They stepped outside, right into the alley behind the shop where the garbage bins are kept, and the brick wall still bears faint graffiti from 10 years ago. My dad didn't even waste time. He offered Jacob $12,000 to break up with me. "I'll write the check right now," he'd said, flat and cold, like it was just another business deal. "You walk away. No more contact. That's it." Jacob told me he laughed at first because it sounded like something out of a bad movie. But my dad wasn't joking. When Jacob refused, told him he wasn't interested in his money, that he loved me and had no intention of vanishing, my dad raised the offer. 18,000. "Think about it," he said. "It's more than you'll make in the next 3 months, probably longer. You're not from our world, son. And no matter how well you mean, that's not going to change." Jacob said he didn't even respond to that. just turned and walked back inside. But he hadn't told me because he didn't want to make me choose. He didn't want me to carry the weight of knowing my father was trying to buy him off like he was an inconvenience to be cleaned up before guests arrived. I sat there frozen, the blood pounding in my ears so loud I could barely hear myself speak. And then I got up, grabbed my phone, and called my father. It didn't matter that it was nearly 1 in the morning. I didn't care if he was asleep or in the middle of a conference call in Tokyo. I needed to say it now. He answered on the third ring, his voice groggy. Samantha? What's wrong? What the hell is wrong with you? I said, loud enough that Jacob flinched. Did you really think I wouldn't find out? There was a pause, just long enough for me to know he understood exactly what I meant. I did what I thought was best, he said finally. It wasn't personal. You tried to bribe my boyfriend. It was an investment, he said. In your future. You're young. You don't see it now, but one day you'll understand that love is not enough. I was shaking, pacing the length of my bedroom barefoot, my free hand balled into a fist. You don't get to make that decision for me. You don't get to pay people to disappear from my life. I was trying to protect you, he said, still calm, still treating it like it was a contract negotiation. You're emotional right now, but in a few years you'll see I saved you from a long, uphill struggle. I don't need saving, I hissed. And if you think the way to help your daughter is to toss money at someone you don't approve of, then you don't know me at all. He didn't respond right away. Maybe because, deep down, he knew I meant every word. Or maybe because, to him, this was just a setback. A failed transaction. I'll always do what's necessary, he said finally. Even when you hate me for it. Congratulations, I said, barely holding back tears. You succeeded. Then I hung up. I dropped the phone onto the bed and sat beside Jacob, who hadn't said a word since I made the call. He just looked at me, and I could tell how much it hurt him to have been put in that position. To be reduced to a number, a cost, a variable to eliminate. I wanted to scream. I wanted to run. But all I could do was hold his hand and sit in the silence of that awful, surreal night, realizing just how far my parents were willing to go to control my life. And that nothing, absolutely nothing, was going to be the same after this. We met at their house, per their request. I should have known something was coming the second I walked in and saw how carefully everything had been arranged. The living room spotless, fresh orchids on the coffee table, my father already standing near the fireplace like he was about to deliver a quarterly report. My mother sat across from him, legs crossed, expression polished and unreadable, the way she always looked when she was about to say something cruel but wanted it to sound refined. I didn't sit down. They didn't ask me to, either. My dad launched right into it. No preamble. No hesitation. We've made a decision, he said, and we need you to be clear-eyed about the consequences. I crossed my arms. About what? About Jacob, my mother answered, her voice flat but clipped with irritation just beneath the surface. This situation has gone far enough. My father took over again. If you continue this relationship, we will no longer be funding your final semester. Tuition, housing, any of it. We're not going to subsidize choices that are reckless and short-sighted. I stared at them, stunned, my mouth open but no words coming out at first. It wasn't even the threat, it was the way they said it. Clinical. Transactional. Like my education, my life, was just another item on a ledger. So that's it. I finally said. It's him or the degree. It's your future, my mother said. You're free to make your own decisions. But actions have consequences. If you choose him, you choose to bear them yourself. I laughed. A single, humorless sound that caught even me off guard. You really think this is going to work? My dad stepped forward. We're not punishing you, Samantha. We're trying to make you see what's at stake. What's at stake? I repeated. Let me guess. My network. My image. My ability to attract someone with a last name that comes with a foundation and a hedge fund. This isn't about money, my mom said, though the irony nearly made me choke. It's about standards. No, I said, cutting her off. It's always been about control. You fund my life so you can own it. So you can weigh in on who I love, what I wear, what I post online, where I intern, what city I live in, what parties I attend. And now, since none of that worked, you think you can just threaten me into submission. Samantha, my dad started, but I raised my hand. No, I'm done pretending this is about concern. You don't want me happy. You want me polished. On track. Predictable. You want me to be someone you can brag about at dinner parties and post about on LinkedIn. But I'm not your trophy. The room went quiet. I took a breath. My heart was racing, but my voice didn't shake when I said it. You can keep your money. You can keep the tuition, the rent, the meal plan, all of it. I'll figure it out. My mom blinked, clearly stunned. My father just stared at me, expression unreadable. I took one last look at both of them, the people who had built my life like a dollhouse they could rearrange at will, and said, you can't buy me. And you sure as hell can't buy Jacob. Then I walked out. The night I left my parents' house for good, it didn't feel like a grand declaration or a dramatic escape. It felt quiet, tired, like stepping out of a room that had been too loud for too long. I packed what I could into 2 duffel bags and a cardboard box full of sketchbooks, grabbed my tablet and charger, and walked out without looking back. Jacob met me at the curb. He didn't say anything, just took the heavier bag from my shoulder and opened the passenger door of his car. We didn't talk much on the drive. We didn't have to. We both knew this was happening faster than we'd planned, but also that waiting wasn't an option anymore. That door had closed, and I wasn't crawling back through it. His apartment was smaller than I remembered. A studio with thin walls and a radiator that groaned like it was haunted. The kitchen was more of a corner. The bathroom door didn't close all the way unless you lifted it slightly while turning the knob, and the only table doubled as both our desk and dinner spot. But it was clean, and quiet, and warm. That night we slept on the same futon we'd used for movie nights. Except now there were no time limits, no late trains to catch, no curfews built into parental expectations. I stared at the ceiling for hours, listening to Jacob's breathing next to me, trying to figure out if I was terrified or free. I think it was both. I started freelancing more seriously the next morning. I dug through old contacts, emailed professors, refreshed job boards like it was a nervous tick. I picked up anything, logo fixes, social media banners, even wedding invitation templates. Nothing glamorous, but it paid. Barely. I also started dog walking for an app that paid in 2-day windows and occasionally babysat for a couple in the building who worked late shifts. I filed for emergency financial assistance through the university and signed a short-term deferment contract on the tuition I still owed. Every form I submitted felt like a reminder of what I'd walked away from, but also what I was walking toward. Jacob took more hours at the cafe, working back-to-back shifts when the manager asked. He came home smelling like espresso grounds and cinnamon scones, his apron always dusted with flour and his voice hoarse from calling out drink orders over the hiss of the steamer. But he never complained. Not once. Not even when we both knew he was running on 5 hours of sleep and $30 grocery runs. And then, one morning while I was sketching a packaging mock-up for a local bakery that paid in cash and free bread, he walked in with this stunned, breathless look on his face. He'd been offered a contract. A small publishing house was printing a memoir by a retired firefighter from St. Paul, and they needed an editor. Someone local, someone affordable, someone hungry. They offered him a flat rate and a deadline that made me wince, but he took it without blinking. That night we celebrated with cheap takeout and half a bottle of wine I'd been saving for a someday that had come sooner than I expected. We sat cross-legged on the floor because we didn't have chairs yet, our plates balanced on our knees, laughing about how grown-up we felt just for having working internet and our names on a lease. It wasn't glamorous. It wasn't polished. It was ramen and shared shampoo and a single drawer each. It was budgeting down to the penny and comparing grocery store apps for deals on eggs. But it was ours. The life we were building, not the one curated for me by people who only understood love in terms of transactions. And somewhere between the messy schedules, the student aid letters, the late-night editing sprints and frantic design submissions, I started to realize I was happy. Scared, stretched thin, uncertain, but happy. For the first time, I wasn't living someone else's version of what my life should be. I was just living. I submitted my final project on a Tuesday afternoon, hands shaking from too much coffee and too little sleep. When I hit submit, it didn't feel like fireworks or confetti, just a slow, settling exhale that I hadn't realized I'd been holding for the better part of a year. I closed my laptop, leaned back on the futon, and stared at the ceiling for a full minute before letting myself believe I'd really done it. I'd finished school. Against every obstacle, every threat, every night wondering if I was about to fall apart. I made it. Graduation wasn't flashy. No cap and gown photos, no celebratory brunch with a flower centerpiece. Just a line of emails confirming I'd passed, and a certificate PDF I printed at the library across the street. But I didn't care. I had my degree, my name on the list, and a job offer waiting in my inbox. A boutique creative agency in North Loop had offered me a junior illustrator role. It wasn't a massive firm or some glossy startup with kombucha on tap, but it was legit. Real projects, a real salary, entry level, sure, but more than I'd ever made in my life. They liked my style. Said my portfolio had voice. I stared at that sentence in the offer letter for almost 10 minutes before I could process it. Someone thought I had a voice. Not potential. Not promise. A voice. The same week, Jacob came home with a paper bag full of celebratory donuts and a huge grin on his face. His manager had offered him a promotion, store supervisor. Full-time. Benefits. More consistent hours, a raise, and the ability to finally stop piecing together side gigs to cover the rent. He'd earned it 10 times over, but it still felt like this quietly monumental moment when he told me. He didn't talk about it like a big deal, just set the donuts on the counter, kissed me on the forehead, and said, "We can start looking for a place with walls now." We found the new apartment after 2 weeks of obsessive scrolling and too many awkward tours. It wasn't big, but compared to our old studio, it felt like a palace. A real kitchen with more than one drawer, a bathtub that didn't wobble when you stepped in, and best of all, an actual bedroom door that closed. We signed the lease on a Tuesday afternoon, picked up the keys that Friday, and moved in with the help of 2 friends and a borrowed pickup truck. The first night in the new place, we ate frozen pizza on the living room floor, surrounded by boxes and half-assembled furniture. There were no curtains yet, and the light from the street lamps spilled through the windows like soft gold. Jacob had his feet propped on a stack of books, and I sat beside him with a cheap glass of red wine balanced on an upside-down laundry basket. We didn't say much. We didn't need to. That night, as we lay in bed under a blanket that still smelled like the old apartment, I realized I felt something I hadn't in a long time. Stable. Not rich. Not finished. Not perfect. Just stable. Solid. And finally, at peace. I scheduled the call the night before. I didn't tell Jacob I was doing it, not because I was hiding it, but because I needed the moment to be mine. Not shared. Not softened. Just real. I set up my laptop on the kitchen counter, angled it so the background caught the edge of our little dining nook, the new bookshelf Jacob had assembled on a Sunday afternoon, and just enough of the window to show the soft evening light falling in. I opened the folder with my degree, the real thing this time, printed on heavy paper and mailed 2 weeks earlier in a flat cardboard envelope I couldn't bring myself to open for 3 days. They answered on the second ring. My mom appeared first, her camera angled too high like always, framing her like a portrait in a museum. My dad came into view a second later, seated in his armchair, already wearing the expression he reserved for press interviews and forced social obligations. "Hi," I said, calm but firm. "Samantha," my mother said, smiling too quickly, too broadly. "We didn't expect to hear from you." "I'm sure you didn't." I held up the diploma. It caught the light just right, the embossed lettering clear, my name printed across the center in serif font. "I finished," I said. "Graduated. On time." My mom blinked, and for once, didn't have anything polished to say. I tilted the camera slightly so they could see more of the room. The soft white curtains we'd thrifted, the fern hanging from the window rod, the mismatched mugs drying by the sink. "This is our place now," I said. "Jacob and me. 2 incomes. 1 bedroom. Not much, but enough. We pay our bills. We cook our dinners. We've got a coffee table we assembled ourselves, and a drawer full of spare change. No silver spoons. No bailouts. No buyouts." My dad let out a low grunt. "Looks cheap." I smiled. "Maybe," I said, "but it's honest. And it's mine. Earned with my time, my work, my life. Not your money. Not your conditions." He looked like he wanted to say more, but I didn't let him. "I just wanted you to see it," I added. "All this, the degree, the job, the roof over my head, this was built with the help of the man you called a nobody, the one you tried to pay off like he was a mistake." My mother shifted in her seat, her smile beginning to fracture. I didn't wait for their reply. I clicked end call, shut the laptop, and stood in the silence of our tiny, steady home, feeling more grounded than I ever had in their sprawling house of expectations. It started with a card. Handwritten, thick paper, my mother's script neat and restrained like always. No apology in the first line, just a careful phrase about hoping we can talk soon, and family being more important than pride. Then a follow-up message a week later, this time from my father, short and almost robotic, offering dinner whenever we felt ready. No mention of Jacob. No mention of anything real. Just an open-ended invitation that hung in the air like smoke. I didn't ignore them, but I didn't give them what they wanted either. I sent back a single message. "Thank you. I'm open to rebuilding something. But only with honesty. Only with respect. And only on my terms." I don't think they knew what to do with that. Maybe for the first time, they realized I wasn't a project they could manage back into compliance. I was never going to be that version of their daughter again. Maybe I never really had been. Meanwhile, life didn't pause for reconciliation. Jacob and I were busy. Between his shifts and my work at the agency, our evenings were crammed with to-do lists and barely enough time for grocery runs. But there was this one idea we kept coming back to. We talked about it on walks, while folding laundry, while watching the pasta water boil. A space of our own. Not just an apartment. A place to build something. A bookstore cafe, small and focused, with local authors, community events, soft light, and strong coffee. We started sketching out ideas on napkins, then spreadsheets, then napkins again. I mocked up logos between freelance commissions. Jacob reached out to local writers, asking about interest. It was early. Maybe too early, but it felt real in a way that nothing ever had under my parents' roof. Some nights we sat on our secondhand sofa and talked about it like it was already happening. Not a fantasy, but a direction. Something chosen. Built. Ours. And somewhere in the middle of all that, I realized I'd stopped asking permission. I wasn't trying to prove anything anymore. Not to my parents, not to professors, not to old classmates with polished lives and empty eyes. I wasn't afraid of starting over, of failing, of being small. I was just myself. And for the first time, that was enough. So yeah, this isn't the end. Not really. It's just the first chapter that I got to write entirely on my own terms. What about you? Would you have made the same choices? Cut your parents off? Taken the risk for someone they refuse to see? I'd love to know what you think, what you would have done in my shoes.